The one with the intestines dangling, that's not the hot kind of vampire. Hey nerd, and welcome to the second installment of my Halloween special. This is part 2 of my deep dive into vampires. In the last video, I talked about how surprisingly important vampires have been in society, holding up a mirror to those less pleasant aspects of the world, and the ways that vampire stories help people who struggle with their identities. This time, I've come with some bullshit about the evolution of vampires through history and some short stories about vampire creatures from different cultures around the world. While vampires as we know them today are a relatively recent invention, their roots run real deep, and real far into the past. The next and final video in this series will be dedicated to tracing historical and archaeological evidence of real life vampires, or at least real life belief in the bloodsuckers. If you like this video, hit the button to let me know, subscribe if you're into this sort of thing, and join my Patreon if you'd like to show some more support. And away we go. So the word vampire developed a lot more recently than stories of the monsters that fit into our current definition of them. The word vampire is derived from uh, it's questionable, really, among historians and etymologists, but the oldest, closest version that people often refer to is from the Slavic language of it's pronounced like opir or opir. I don't know how to pronounce it. Vipir. It's spelled Opyrb. That's like the earliest, closest word to what we're talking about. Dog. I don't know if you saw him. Folklore about what we now know as vampires has existed since prehistory. Historians, folklorists, and nerds of this type tend to refer to those things as revenants, which is just a word for an undead creature, and vampires fall into this category. They get real mixed up with zombies sometimes. That's a whole thing that I haven't talked about. So, when we think of vampires today, we have a list of traits or characteristics that we use to define these beloved and feared undead creatures. There are versions of undead creatures that eat people or take their life force going further back than we can really measure. It seems like a fear that has existed among humanity and within our stories, perhaps from the beginning. We've been worried about vampires since the dawn of time because being eaten is weird and we don't like it. The most basic and definitive trait that makes a vampire by our modern standards is subsisting off of the life force or blood of the living. Sometimes it's specifically the blood of the innocent or the young, the blood of virgins, is preferred. Some say that the blood of the youthful is how vampires remain young themselves, or it's how they sustain their immortality. Others speculate that youthful blood is the snack of choice simply because it's more pure. The dichotomy between purity and perversion is an essential element of modern vampire lore. There is actually scientific evidence that cycling the blood of a young person through an old person's body can rejuvenate their organs, like the organs of the older person. There was a study done on rats, like a couple decades ago, that showed connecting the circulatory system of an older rat to a younger rat would lead to cell rejuvenation in the body of the older rat. Aging is like essentially the result of cell death within our bodies, and cells heal themselves using blood. So as we age, there's less good stuff in our blood, and then our cells are less successful at rejuvenating themselves. And when younger blood hasn't been, which hasn't been cycled through the system as many times as introduced, the cells within the organs are able to use it to sort of revitalize themselves, and it's actually really cool. I learned about that when I was like 20 years ago. I learned about that when I was trying to figure out how to become immortal myself. So I don't have a source, I just remember it. You know, Blood Boys. You know about Blood Boys. That. Anyway, regardless of which type of blood a creature prefers to drink, or why they choose to drink it, it seems as though the consumption of blood is the primary identifier of a vampire. All other characteristics are secondary and have to come along with this dietary preference. Other common vampire traits are being undead, whether that means a reanimated corpse, which we typically consider to be more like a zombie these days, or if it's a person whose humanity has departed their body, or if it's more of a magical person who exists between the realms of the living and the dead. We consider this state of not quite alive to be a major trait of a vampire. Immortality, everlasting youth, or freakishly extended longevity is another common vampire trait. We also see vampires who have superhuman strength and speed, who can shapeshift into bats, wolves, or even other people. Many vampires are depicted as having the power to manipulate and control minds. Sometimes they can fly or be impervious to physical damage, such as from swords or bullets. None of these traits on their own does a vampire make, but pair any of them with the thirst for blood, and there, a vampire you have. Vampires as we know them now have a handful of weaknesses, depending on the source. Some of these include dead man's blood, that one's cool, crucifixes, garlic, sunlight, and any number of things, really. Despite the weaknesses, there are only a few ways to kill them. The most common is a stake through the heart, which is made of wood or iron. You can also light them on fire, expose them to sunlight so they turn to ash, or you can behead them. Some of those we will see in the third and final episode of my vampire series, so look for that. I came across an interesting feature of Old Slavic vampire lore. Folk tradition states that during the first 40 days after reanimation, a vampire can be destroyed by a professional vampire hunter or by a wolf. Just a wolf. I wonder if this may be the origin of the vampires versus werewolf thing in modern media. I choose to think so. The methods used to become a vampire have changed a great deal over time and with different retellings of the stories. Old Slavic stories suggest that there are personal traits that put people in danger of becoming a vampire after death. Those most at risk are drunks, thieves, murderers, witches, the unbaptized, those who've drowned, and those who've committed suicide, or those who die of the plague. And that's quite a list. One thing worth noting here is that, as I mentioned in the first video of the series, this seems to be a list of things that society doesn't like. In this way, vampirism is used as a threat to those who would step outside of the social norms. If you don't baptize your kid, when they die, they'll come back as a vampire. If you drink too much, you might come back as a vampire. These are some of the oldest stories about vampires, so we can see that long ago these tales served the purpose of promoting adherence to good behavior. The old school description of a vampire, based on beliefs like this, is a tainted spirit which possesses a decomposing body, or the perverted spirit of the one who is dead turned evil by the need for revenge, or because of the torment suffered in purgatory after death. The Derga Dua, which I made a video about sometime in the spring, is a fun example of the revenge thing. The method of becoming a vampire by being bitten is relatively new. Assertions that one can become a vampire as a result of being bitten by an already existing vampire seem to have first appeared in the 1700s. This is when people first started reporting that people were transforming after being attacked, though the method of attack wasn't always biting. Sometimes people would say that they witnessed someone transforming after being scratched or grabbed. Recall that the 1700s were an interesting time for spooky monster-based superstition, because it was the height of the witch and werewolf crazes in Europe. And also, there was an event that involved decomposing bodies that got people really interested in vampires across Europe, vampires specifically. More on that in my next video. It seems that most of these attack-based transformation reports came from Eastern Europe. This idea that one can become a vampire after being bitten was solidified as a major part of vampire lore after Bram Stoker's Dracula was released. Dracula is the first well-known, widely accessible story that includes this trope. The more modern vampire is mostly attributed to Bram Stoker. His literature influenced our perception of the undead. Dracula quickly became the quintessential vampire, and he is now the standard by which we judge the vampireness of all those who've come after him. Bram Stoker took inspiration from countless old-school vampire tales from around the world when he created his horror icon. While most commonly people like to say that Dracula was based on Vlad the Impaler, there is a great deal of evidence to show that he drew inspiration from folkloric sources much more than he did from Vladiboy. While Dracula is an extremely important figure in the history of vampires, I'm going to skip talking about him too much, and instead I shall tell you about some more obscure old school vampire types from different places around the world. By telling you a bit about them, I'm hoping that we can get a solid foundation on a few key vampire points. The first goal of sharing these different stories is that it'll help us conceptualize just how pervasive stories of creatures like this have been within the human psyche. By emphasizing the fact that tales of creatures like this have existed since the dawn of time, pretty much, and how the idea of vampire like creatures has existed in so many cultures around the world, we can see what a big deal this type of story is for us, like as a species. We really like telling stories about these types of entities. Second, I hope to provide enough information from varied sources that we're able to lay out a framework for what exactly makes a vampire. Whether we agree or not about these creatures fitting the bill of vampire, by recognizing that some people say that's what they are, we can better understand how varied, evolving, and complicated vampire lore is. What we, as a collective, tend to imagine a vampire is. If we see how the older versions of these creatures across different cultures are represented, we can maybe get a feel for how and why they've come to be what we know them as today. Exhibit A. One of the most controversial examples I have for you, but also one of the oldest. Some people consider Lilith from Christian mythology to be a vampire. Lilith is a figure who has appeared in religious texts since before Christianity, though she is most commonly referenced today as a Christian mythological figure. She appears in ancient Jewish, Mesopotamian, and Sumerian stories, although by slightly varied names. Scholars have scoured through and pieced together bits of these older texts and tales, compared them with the Old Testament, and admittedly taken some liberties when filling in the gaps. Much of what scholars consider canon in regard to Lilith are based on assumptions and educated guesses based on available sources. While details and opinions regarding Lilith vary, there is a consensus among scholars that she was the original wife of Adam. While she, or figures which resemble her, appear starting in prehistory, much of her story was developed during the Middle Ages. Many believe that she originated as a Mesopotamian storm demon, having appeared in Sumerian texts from 4000 BC, referred to as a type of demon called a Lilitu. I personally don't like to draw too many conclusions based on similar sounding words, but there is often some connection seen in language like this. According to many sources, in ancient Jewish texts, Adam is first made from dust and feels lonely. Lilith was made from dust as well, and although Adam chose her to be his mate, Lilith regarded herself as his equal, for they were made of the same dust. She refused to submit to Adam and was ultimately expelled, or maybe left willingly, from the Garden of Eden. She was found later, swimming in the Red Sea, fucking demons and making a legion of demon babies. God told Lilith that she had to go back to Adam, or she would spend every day watching her children die. She chose the latter, but reasonably was pretty pissed off about the whole killing her kids thing. Then Eve was made out of Adam's rib to replace her as Adam's wifey. Lilith then vowed to kill all of their babies. Even's even, right? Some believe that Lilith was actually the serpent in the Garden of Eden who convinced Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge. In the King James Bible, Lilith is mentioned in Isaiah 34:14. The creatures of the desert will encounter jackals, and the satyr will call to its kind. Indeed, Lilith will settle there and find herself a place of rest. This is in a section describing what will happen when God passes judgment on all nations. Those who defied God would forever live in a wasteland, and Lilith will be there. She is often depicted as having wings like a vulture, shape-shifting into scary animals like the serpent, demonic, a drinker of blood, and a killer of babies. This is a decent pile of traits that we do attribute to vampires. And Lilith has been a figure which represents evil and all of those things that people find to be bad or scary. In this way, Lilith fits pretty well into the description of a vampire, making her essentially a vampire which has existed in Christianity, Judaism, and old Mesopotamian beliefs. The next super old vampire-ish deity that we'll be discussing is Sekhmet. People these days argue that the ancient Egyptian goddess Sekhmet is a vampire. I love Sekhmet, so this is a fun one for me. Her story is pretty intense and a little bit tragic. Sekhmet was the goddess of the desert sun, plague, war, chaos, and also healing. She was born from the Eye of Ra, when Ra looked down on humanity and found that they weren't acting right. Because humans were not living by the laws he wished to see, he created Sekhmet to punish them and hold them to obedience. She is depicted as a woman with a lion's head wearing a disk of the sun, like this. She was considered a protector of the pharaohs and she guided them in war. But like I said, she was also a goddess of healing and was respected by doctors. Horse, ugh, her story, horsey, her story goes that she was unleashed upon the people to punish them for living incorrectly, sinning and acting fools, And she was supposed to go around chugging the blood of everyone who was not following the laws of Ra. She ended up getting a little bit overexcited, and instead of just killing those that deserved it, she went wild and started ripping everyone apart. Ra was like, "Oh no, that's not quite what I meant." And the people decided they needed to do something to stop her before she slaughtered everyone. They realized that she loved drinking blood, so they thought maybe they could trick her with red wine. All of the blood that was flowing from her victims had been pooling like lakes in the towns. So people gathered all of the red wine that they could, and they dumped it into a field to make a lake of wine, but it looked like blood. This successfully tricked Sekhmet, who went to go drink her gnarly lake of blood. She ended up getting unbelievably wine drunk and passing out. She was subdued enough for Ra to sort of get into and rewire her brain. When she awoke, hungover and confused, and in a much better mood, she was now called Hathor, and her new assignment was to protect and promote love and peace. She became the goddess of beauty, fertility, and love. Many people today consider Sekhmet to have been one of the earliest entities which can be called a vampire. This association is due largely to her thirst for blood, because she would feed on the blood of her victims and drink the rivers of blood which flowed from battlefields. Aside from the drinking of blood and her immense power, I found no other traits that scream vampire, in my opinion. However, because the definition of vampire is so broad, and every culture or decade has a different list of traits for them, drinking blood might be enough for her to fit the label. What do you think? Let me know in the comments if you think that Sekhmet counts as a vampire. Our next beastie is a lot different from the last two, and he comes from India. The Vetali is a type of spirit that is recognized in Hindu spiritual beliefs. The Vetali is an undead creature similar to a ghoul, which serves the role of the trickster within the mythology. They tend to hang around cemeteries and forests, and I mean literally hang around, because they're described as hanging upside down from trees while they wait for people to bother, much like a bat. When people run into the Vetali, they become the victim of malicious pranks. The Vetali are undead, in the sense that they exist between the realms of the living and the dead, giving them vast amounts of mystical knowledge and the ability to observe the past, present, and future. Legends of the Vetali date back to the 11th century, when it was popularized by a series of Indian children's stories. The collection of tales is called the Vetali Panchvimshati. Panchvimshati? I don't know. That. The collection of stories was originally written in Sanskrit. In the stories, a sorceress asks a king to capture a Vetali. Every time the king approaches the creature, though, he's given a riddle and some weird rules. If the king knows the answer, the Vetali will go free, flying back to its perch. If the king does not know the answer, the Vetali will go with him willingly. If the king does know the answer, but doesn't say it out loud, trying to act like he doesn't know it, his head will explode. In 24 of the 25 Vetali stories in the collection, the king answers the riddle correctly, so the Vetali keeps getting away. The 25th time, the Vetali asks, if a prince marries the queen and a princess marries the king, and each couple has a baby, what is the relation between the two newborns? This weird question stumps the king. Because he doesn't know the answer, the Vetali goes with him, and is forced to work with the sorceress. While the creature and the king go back to meet with the sorceress, though, the Vetali says that she only wants his power because she wants to kill the king and take over his country. The two of them decide to betray and kill the sorceress instead, and the Vetala will protect the kingdom afterward and be a faithful helper to the king. These old stories paint the Vetala as a powerful entity which is neither good nor evil, but can be benevolent and even helpful. However, today, the Vetala is considered demonic and frightening, described in more recent works as being a hostile spirit who causes madness and kills children, or as a vampiric demon who possesses humans and causes their hands and feet to twist backward, their skin to turn green, and their fingernails to become poisonous talons. These descriptions are way different from the old stories. For this, we can collectively blame Sir Richard Burton. He was a British explorer and writer who was the first to bring these stories from India to a Western audience. He chose the word vampire as his translation for the word Vetala instead of using something more accurate like spirit. The illustrations he used with his text also depicted it being really spooky, with leathery wings and bulging eyes. Perhaps he clung to the idea of how the Vetala hangs upside down around cemeteries, and then likened it to a bat, and then drew some drastic conclusions between bats, vampires, and the Vetala. That's my guess. Our next case study is actually pretty upsetting. My favorite vampire creature from beyond Europe and general Western culture is the gnarly-ass Manananggal. I hope I pronounced that right. I don't know what two G's together sounds like. A terrifying entity found in folklore from the Philippines. This grotesque creature's most well-known characteristic is that it likes to rip its own body in half, separating its upper body from its lower body. It pulls itself apart at the torso, and then it flies around as only its top half, while its entrails hang and dangle out the bottom of it. It leaves its lower half behind while it hunts. Imagine finding that. The upper body is equipped with massive bat-like wings and monstrous fangs, and it also has a long, weird tongue which acts like a proboscis, like on a mosquito. The Manananggal uses its wings to fly through the night searching for prey. It is said that when the Manananggal's victim of choice is that its victim of choice is often pregnant women, and when it finds them, it uses the proboscis tongue to slurp the fetus out. With its other victims, it uses this same method to drink large quantities of their blood. Other common victims of this creature are newlyweds, lovers, babies, and sometimes men whose brides-to-be got cold feet or otherwise dipped out before the wedding. Many believe that this creature can be repelled with garlic, holy water, or salt, much like tales of other vampire-like creatures from other parts of the world. An excerpt from a text called Customs of the Tagalogs, dated to 1589, written by a friar named Juan de Plasencia, reads, "The seventh was called Magtatagal, and his purpose was to show himself at night to many persons without his head or entrails. In such wise the devil walked about and carried, or pretended to carry, his head to different places, and in the morning returned it to his body, remaining as before alive. This seems to be a fable, although the natives affirm that they have seen it, because the devil probably caused them so to believe. This occurred in Catanduanes." So brutal. Love that. Ugh. Another lesser-known creature, which I find pretty fascinating, the Jiangshi. Entities which are prevalent in ancient Chinese belief systems. Or maybe it's Jiangshu. Ancient Chinese belief systems. These guys might have more in common with the dominant Western versions of vampires from around the turn of the millennium. As you may remember, the most prolific version of vampires in early Christian times were individuals who would die, then be reanimated as evil things. The Jiangshi from China are closer to this concept than other vampire-like creatures that we've discussed so far. It is believed that the Jiangshi are the souls of people who are brought to a level of sentience by a sorcerer, and who have been pulled back to walk the earth on a journey to their rightful resting place. It was believed that people should be laid to rest in their hometown, So when someone passed away elsewhere, their families would often work hard to get their loved ones home to be buried. When this couldn't physically happen, often a sorcerer or a magic worker would be sent to the site where the loved one was buried. It would be the job of the sorcerer to pull the spirit of the person out of the body or back into it, depending on your interpretation, and lead it safely back home. This was done by writing a spell upon a piece of paper and sticking it to the face of the deceased. This would create the Jiangshi, a soul tied to the earth until it accomplished its goal, controlled and cared for by the sorcerer. This is all well and good unless something unfortunate happens while they make their trek to the final resting place. If something happens to the sorcerer along the way, or the sorcerer chooses to release it, then the creature is freed to roam the earth. And sometimes the sorcerer would do this just to be a dick, like if the family was unable to pay them the fare. The magic worker can pull off the spell paper, which they had placed on the corpse's face, and relinquish their power over the spirit. When this happens, the Jiangshi gains its own consciousness and becomes malevolent. They go batshit crazy and develop a lust for blood. They begin hunting down living things to absorb their life essence. These creatures are described as having long, curved fingernails and green, furry skin. This description probably comes from the way partially decomposed bodies look when they're dug up, like a little moldy, right? Our final vampire creature today, and the one most often credited as the OG vampire, is the Striggoi. This is an undead creature known in Romanian folklore. One of the earliest historical mentions of the story is the story of Jure Grando Alilovic, don't know how to pronounce, did best, who lived from 1579 to 1656. He is believed to be the first individual who has been accused of being a vampire, though he has been called a Striggoi, which is obviously a different word meaning just about the same thing. He was accused of terrorizing his village for 16 years after he passed away. Eventually, the locals got together with a priest, dug up his corpse, and beheaded him. This story, and the beliefs surrounding the Striggoi, epitomize the most widespread and popular depictions and rituals associated with what we now call vampires. Within the folkloric tales of Romania, there are multiple types of Striggoi. The first is a witch or sorcerer who becomes a sort of half-living, half-dead creature and feeds upon the life forces of the living to maintain their power. Another type is a terrible or unfortunate man who transforms into this same sort of half-living, half-dead creature and who also hunts and consumes the living. The third is the most commonly known, the undead. These are individuals who died and were reanimated, climbing out of their graves at night to terrify and hunt the people of their village, or often their own family members. Striggoi are described as being pale and gaunt, with bald or balding heads. Their eyes are wide open and their faces are twisted and gnarled looking. Some sources state that a Striggoi's spine may become elongated and stretch out the back end like a freaky tail. That's neat. There are several factors which can put someone at risk of becoming a Striggoi after death. A person may suffer this fate if they are the seventh child of the same sex in a family, if they commit suicide, if they live a life of sin, or if their death is the result of a curse. These are the same causes of vampirism that we see more often in that region. Now that we've talked about all the weird and interesting creatures from old school folklore around the world, which we now recognize as vampires, or at least vampire adjacent, hopefully we can see the underlying themes. While the most important one is simply the fact that they drink blood or otherwise consume the life force from other living beings, we can see a few other parallels among them all, right? The first comes to mind is the fact that they are not friendly. Whether it be the Striggoi or the Jiangshi, or if it be a god-level deity like Lilith or Sekhmet, the idea is that they are frightening and we have to be worried about making them angry or looking tasty around them. The exception being the original Vetali. But after those stories were translated by a European with European brains, they quickly became scary. If they weren't made... Wait. If they weren't made to be scary eventually, we probably wouldn't actually consider them a vampire creature. They would be something like coyote in Native American beliefs. They're a trickster, right? They'd just be goofy. Another trait that they all share is that they are not wholly corporeal. While they have got living bodies, which move around on the earth, their soul exists in between life and death. With Sekhmet and Lilith, it's a stretch for them to fit this criteria, but they do both exist beyond the basic normal reality for humanity, being godlike. You know what I mean? Can you think of any other similarities that they all share? Or is there one or even a few of them that stand out as being drastically different from the others? Drop it in the comments and let me know what you think. Today, vampires are very different from any of these guys though, right? Today, vampires are dark, calm, elegant, and quite often depicted as sexy. Lilith might be sort of sexy if you're into demon babes, but otherwise, most people probably wouldn't want to get it on with the Manananggal, with its guts flapping around, and probably wouldn't want to touch butts with a pale-hunched, gnarled Striggoi. There was also a series of panics in the 1700s, which were relatively fresh in history at the time. The early modern witch craze and the werewolf craze, which totally traumatized Europe. Modern vampire is thanks to Stoker. Before him, they were almost always hideous, terrifying, and partially rotten. Also, let me know if there are any cool, obscure creatures that fit the bill for this list, but I didn't get around to discussing. If I get recommendations, I may cover them in a little lore video sometime later on. Thanks for sticking with me through part 2 of my Vampire Halloween special. The next and final video for this project will be popping up soon. I encourage you to keep an eye out for it if you're interested in weird burial rites and following humanity's ebb and flow between madness and normalcy. Remember to like the video if you enjoyed my yapping, subscribe to the channel for more of my nonsense, and join my Patreon, which is patreon.com/backalleyalchemist, if you want to engage in more conversation, get insight into my process, and get some special access to things I do. Hopefully, I'll see you there. Later, nerd, and happy Halloween!